So good afternoon, good morning, everyone, depending on where you are. I'm Anne Duncan. I'm the director of the British Council in France and absolutely delighted to welcome you today to this webinar and this seminar, which we hope will be quite interactive. It's actually a very important group that we have debating a topic that is extremely important, and even more so, we'll be looking at the relationship here in France. So just as a very brief introduction, I think that we all know that transnational education has become one of the most important trends and opportunity areas, and it responds to a number of different things that have developed across a very wide range of over time. I think we'll hear today more about how do we define that construct. How do we understand transnational education as it has evolved? We have the experts to help us understand that, but also to look at what have the impacts been and why is this becoming such an important part of the education landscape. The British Council has been very active in this area. We recently published a report on the local impact of transnational education and some pilot studies that we sort of got down deeply into. But I think one of the most important things that we're looking at is how is it actually an enabler? How is it enabling and how is it developing in different ways in different locations? And who are the main actors and what are they doing to create innovation in this space? The British Council is very delighted to also be collaborating with our colleagues from across the landscape of the higher education sector, as well as our very good collaborators from the Embassy of France. And so with that, I will just pass it over to the chair of our session, which I believe is you, Gabriele Cavallini. Is that correct?
Thanks very much, Anne. Welcome, everyone. So I'm going to be chairing our first roundtable on what is the future of Franco-British transnational education, spotlight on joint programs and international campuses. A bit about myself, and I'm reader in science and engineering education at Queen Mary University of London, and I'm director of the Center for Academic Inclusion in Science and Engineering at Queen Mary. But my sort of main operational activity is leading one of three Queen Mary's joint institutes in China, Queen Mary Engineering School of Northwestern Polytechnical University in Xi'an in China. And so what we thought it was interesting is actually having a bit of chairing and in the neutral space, but interrogating from that space of transnational education in China. As you would know, transnational education for the UK, China and Southeast Asia areas are really strong. But so it's very interesting for me to hear a bit more of what happens in the space in Europe in particular, and try to see where the joint challenges and opportunities come. And so that would be my outlook into here. And we have two very expert panelists today. So we're going to actually start with them giving a brief introduction into the topic. And so I'm going to actually introduce them just before their own sector. So I'm going to start with our first panelist, Dr. Tim Gore, who's Chief Executive Officer at the University of London Institute in Paris. And he has a breadth of experience in senior leadership positions in France, UK, India, Jordan, Dubai, Singapore, and Hong Kong. So quite a lot of experience internationally in higher education, cultural relations, diplomacy, and commercial enterprise. So welcome, Tim. Let's have your introduction to the topic.
Thank you very much, Gabriel, for that very kind introduction. And really pleased to be here, and thank you to the British Council for organising this. I do have to declare that I have British Council DNA in my blood. I was 20 years with the British Council in various countries in the world. And in fact, my first experience of TNE was the late 80s in Hong Kong, when some pioneering UK universities got together to work with us in Hong Kong and set up the Centre for Distance Learning, which I which I managed at the time. I remember working with colleagues from Leicester, Strathclyde, other universities on some of their pioneering T&E work at that time. And I've kept in touch with the sector over the years, working in various different places. And talking with Gabriel yesterday, we both agreed that the transnational is a really, really interesting part of the higher education landscape. It's a part of the landscape where there's an enormous amount of innovation. It's a very, perhaps a poorly understood part of the higher education landscape, but it is a very diverse, very innovative, very interesting, and as we can all see, a growing part of the landscape. Is it growing at the moment? Actually, nobody knows, because we don't have the statistics post-pandemic to see really what's happening. We don't have many statistics to say what's happening in global mobility of higher education students since the pandemic started to wane, and we don't have the up-to-date statistics on transnational. So there's a lot to be played for. It's a very challenging global market at the moment, if we can call it a market, for transnational. There are a lot of obviously geopolitical pressures at work, and Gabriel will be familiar with some of these. Here in Europe, we're familiar with other ones. So we might touch on those as we go along. It's a very challenging economic environment at the moment. So students around the world are having to think very carefully about how they invest in their own and their families' higher education. So I think that's an issue we need to talk about. What I'd like to do in my introduction is just very briefly tell you a little bit about the Institute here and the University of London generally, and then give a brief sketch of what I see of some of the sort of systemic issues that affect transnational education in the Franco-British relationship and in the wider European relationship. And then I'll hand over to my colleagues, and we'll hopefully go into some discussion around this. ULIP, as we call it, the University of London Institute in Paris, has been here since the 19th century, so it's a very long-standing part of the Franco-British relationship. It went through various transformations. It was a Franco-British enterprise based in Sorbonne University as part of the University of Paris for many, many years, before becoming the Central Institute of the University of London in the 70s, which we've been ever since. We're a full campus. We're very small. We have about 250 students, about 20 faculty on site. But we do everything that a university would do. We have an undergraduate, postgraduate research activity. Our academics are research active and research led. We have a very active engagement with the public in our public seminars and research seminars activity. So we do all of these things that you would expect of a university, and our students here do all the things you would expect of students of universities. Most of them are international. We only have a handful of French students. Otherwise, our students come from many different countries, and they come here. They study in this fantastic city in Paris, and also enjoy being in this, and have a great time being in this fantastic student environment here. Of course, before I came to Paris and before I ran the institute here, I worked for the international programs, as it was called at the time, which is the University of London's transnational branch, which, as you probably know, has around 50,000 students around the world studying on programs and working through either independently or through recognized teaching centers to study for University of London degrees. So this is an important part of the T&E landscape, and they have about nearly 400 students studying in France, for example, at the moment, many of them studying on law degrees, which is probably a sensible choice. If you want to study commercial law, you probably need to study Anglo-Saxon commercial law, and that's something that they can access through our degrees. So that's a little bit of a portrait of what we do. In terms of some of the issues that affect the transnational environment in Europe, obviously we have to take into account Brexit when we're talking about the UK sector, because that has posed us a lot of challenges, I think, going forward. It's also perhaps given us opportunities, and perhaps it's also been a call to action for some of the British universities when European students were paying domestic fees in the UK and coming to the UK. Many of my French friends and colleagues said that they found the UK a little bit, what's the word, reactive to their relationship with Europe. And perhaps Brexit has given us a call to engage more actively. So I think that's an important thing. But I think one of the underlying issues when we talk about the interaction between the European higher education landscape and the British higher education landscape is the basic economic model that separates us. As you all know, the British economic model is that students should themselves try and meet a realistic cost of higher education, and the way that the government supports that is through student loans. And that's been something that's differentiated the British sector from, for example, the French sector, where a large part of all of the public institutions are paid for by the taxpayer, and the actual cost to students is pretty negligible. So that sets an economic model that makes it very, very difficult for universities to collaborate on, for example, mobility. The demise of Erasmus made that, the fact that UK has opted out of Erasmus, put a further difficulty into that area of mobility. And the Turing scheme has yet to really bed down as a replacement. And in any case, it has its own structural problems in being essentially one way. So it makes it very difficult to match that up. And that has caused other problems as well, because in many cases, European alliances were underpinned by Erasmus. So even though it might be an alliance that's aiming to promote joint research, it's underpinned by mobility of staff and students, which was again underpinned by the multilateral framework that Erasmus provided. So Brexit has moved us away from a multilateral framework that was really useful for British institutions, and it's meant that we've all had to scrabble around and deal with one-to-one relationships, bilateral relationships, or at the most sort of, which at the very sort of efficiency level is much, much less efficient and gives us that problems. Plus the T&E environment across Europe is fragmented. The T&E regulations in each European country are different. So again, there's that to contend with, and I think we have to be aware of that. The UK transnational sector is very focused on Asia and the Middle East. Probably about 85% of the T&E sector is there. The T&E sector has developed over the years, and it's become a big. We all know that in the UK, the transnational has overtaken the number of mobile students coming to the UK to study. But further than that, it's provided a pathway into UK studies so that students are able to take 1 or 2 years of a degree in their home country and move it to the second or third year of a UK degree. And that's been a really thriving part of the T&E landscape. Is that true of Europe? Again, the economic model is a difficult one, and it makes it very expensive for students to consider a third year or a second and third year in the UK. So that does conspire against it. In the overall transnational landscape, campuses, and I represent a campus here, and as does Jeremy and some of Kent's work, are an absolute minority. They're something like 6% of the T&E provision worldwide is on campuses. So although it's quite a prominent and a very interesting model, it's one that hasn't proliferated in Europe for various reasons, legal reasons. As I said, each country has its own setup, and I was very pleased to see that Lancaster University has opened its branch in Leipzig recently, and that's a departure which many universities will look at and to see how that's working. But there are actually very, very few UK campuses across Europe. Gabriel knows about the Malta activities of Queen Mary on the medical school. There are some Greek activities and some others across Europe, but by and large, it's a small part of the scenario. So what is the prevalent model in Europe? Well, I think there's a lot to be played for. There are many experimentations going on, and we'll hear how Warwick is approaching this, I think, from their partners, and we'll hear about some other examples, and certainly from Jeremy about how Kent is approaching Europe. But what is clear is that there's an imperative to do more. The Brexit changes brought about a situation where the main sender companies, and France is included in this, will continue to have a fairly large number of European students going to the UK. But many of the European countries have seen the number of students going to the UK reduced considerably, and the amount of activity and partnership with the UK reduced considerably, and Eastern Europe is a case in point. And in our current geopolitical situation, looking to some of the changes that we see, looking to the war, looking to what's happening in Hungary, looking to what's happening in Italy, we're seeing real changes where it could be argued that higher education has an enormous role to play in diplomatic relations and knowledge diplomacy relations with those parts of Europe, and UK stands to lose out on this because there's so little provision and so little engagement there. But that again is to play for. So I think I'll stop there and hand over to my colleagues, and perhaps we can go into some discussion about these issues further down the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Actually, I found a lot of parallels, even if we tend to think that the sector is different across the world, but actually there's a lot of parallel thinking there. The next panelist is Jeremy Carrett, Professor of Philosophy, Religion and Culture and Dean for Europe at the University of Kent. He is responsible for the strategic engagement of the university outreach in Europe, working with international partnership team, the European campuses in Brussels and Paris, and the regional research networks in Europe. So, Jeremy, all over to you.
Thank you, Gabriel, and thank you, Tim. I think we've got an interesting set of questions ahead of us in this discussion, but just to give you a little sense of my role and my perspective is broadly one of strategy, and that's guiding the university in terms of how it can both engage with our campuses, the Brussels School of International Studies and the Paris School of Arts and Cultures, and also our multiple partners where we have exchange agreements, and also supporting the research infrastructure. So there's a multidimensional aspect of it. And I think Tim's already brought up some of the kind of questions I really want to sort of push a little further. And that's around the question of what on earth are we talking about when we reflect upon the transnational education? Because I think this phrase is itself obfuscating to the discussion. And as a philosopher, it's important to get terms more accurate so that we know that we're talking about the same thing, or at least can identify that we're talking about different things. And in order to do that, I think that we have to, first of all, put forward models of what we think T&E is, in order then we might be able to kind of differentiate some of the discussion of the activity that we're doing in Europe and across the world. So I'm going to sort of speculate at three ways of looking at T&E. And I think the dominant one that we're probably, as those who are in management or in administrative functions related to T&E, probably would fall within this category. And that's what I would call the functional activity model of looking at T&E, by which it means broad in a very loose sense is any activity that a university carries out in a country other than the country of its main campus, which is so broad enough to say that anything that we're doing which engages a national border. Now, I think this is useful and loose enough to recognize that there is a spectrum of approaches and a level of intensity that we can get in transnational education. But I think at some level, it also enables us to see that we have what we call in Kent light T&E and full T&E. And often when we're talking about T&E, we often mean the full version, which is the campus, of which Tim and I work in particular contexts in France. So this, of course, requires a lot of investment and a different set of mission for a university to get involved in that level of engagement. But I think at what we may call a lighter model, we're all engaged in lots of different kinds of activity. And that needs to be acknowledged from all of the accreditation agreements, the dual awards, all the program exchanges that we have, as well as international partnerships, a model where we send students abroad through mobility programs. So I think we have quite a large net of different things that the transnational experience incorporates on this activity model. Now, I think that we're probably all very comfortable with that analysis, but I think it's a bit too comfortable in terms of just looking at activity. And I think as educational institutions, we need to push that a little further. And I think we also have another model, which is I call the values model of T&E, that there is something within that phrase which signals something about commitment, value to a model of education. And I think that this is a particularly important recognition in terms of winning an institutional backing for the activity. If there is a values-driven understanding of T&E, it means that we believe that there's something implicit within it that is important to education. And I think that this actually drives much of the activity that we do, even though we don't talk about a values-led T&E. But if you believe in the sense that the international is a space where particular forms of learning can occur, where particular forms of student experience can occur, and that we have a pedagogical model that says that if you integrate within these activities, all of those ones I've just described, then in somehow you're transforming the values of you and education, then I think that we need to talk more about it as a values space as well. And I also then want to introduce a third level of T&E, of which I would call, to be more philosophical, an epistemic model, i.e. that it's about the very structure of knowledge itself. In one sense, and this goes for those of you who like globalization theory, we've always had transnational education because we've been a species which has always traveled and connected and been mobile. And so T&E, you could say, is the very first act of stepping beyond one's immediate terrain for finding life. But by what I mean by the epistemic model is really one that recognizes there is no knowledge without relationship, that knowledge is fundamentally a relational activity. And when you put T&E in an epistemic framework, then you're also saying that it's not just a value, but actually it's the very quality of knowledge itself. Now, I appreciate this is a kind of bigger assertion, but it's one that I would like to kind of support as actually driving the fact if you want to learn, you have to connect. And therefore, it's about outreach. It's about moving beyond your own borders. And indeed, overcoming boundaries is an act of knowledge making, building relationships. We know nothing without the other. The other is the form of knowledge development. So I'd like to sort of push our utilitarian models to these other domains of values and also in terms of knowledge itself, the epistemic idea. Now, I say all that, which I'll end my abstract discussion to give you a sense of why all of those things matter to the University of Kent. Because if you put all of that together, you have all the drivers that make a university invest and have a mission in a particular country. Because the functional element doesn't always work on its own. It needs something supporting it. And the reason that we ended up in Brussels and in Paris is because we were driven by a basic philosophical idea of education, that we wanted to build education in a location relevant to the subject, that would speak to the subject. So to teach in English in a location relevant to the subject. That's been our little mantra of how we've fundamentally driven our whole TNE agenda. So there has to be this kind of reason of what I've talked about in other discussions with Tim and other forums, what I call the logic of TNE. And the logic of TNE requires some sense of why do I put my energy and the investment as a university into that particular place. And I think that means that we are in Brussels because it's the center of the EU Commission, NATO, the Human Rights Court, and we build models there around social science subject areas, including international law and international relations, international development, etc. So there is a logic of the place that makes it relevant. And in that sense, other than the pandemic, you need to go out into the city, and the city becomes the university teaching space. So the apparatus of teaching is the city or the place that you're in. There's no differentiation. It's not just that you have a place there, but you go into the city and what it offers you, and that is the thing that drives the market. In terms of Paris, of course, we apologies to the French. I'm married to somebody from France, so I think I can allow that there are all sorts of different constructions of the French, but we constructed Paris through an arts and culture structure. Forgive the mathematicians and the scientists in Paris, but we understood that the place speaks because of literary associations, Simone de Beauvoir, Paul Sartre, etc. That a cafe culture was something that we could work with in our market. So the relevancy of it is the museums, the cafes, the traditions of philosophy, the traditions of the history of art that we could build around. Again, the place speaking to while we're there. And I think the politics of, I mentioned teaching in English, of course. And of course, I think that those pedagogical moments of international education are relevant there. And I think we need to think a little bit about what our values of transnational mean in terms of that imperialistic assumption of teaching in English in countries that don't predominantly have that. Though Sciences Po now teaches in English. So we have to recognize that the French have also made those moves to recognizing that the breach of market means that language comes into play there. But I think that maybe we can pick up on the politics of language in terms of transnational education and what that might mean. But I think all of these things together mean that there has to be the drive to making that decision for why you want to be in that country. So the logic of place is very important. But the other key part of the success of this is that the relationships that we have in any particular country are about the value of other university relationships. So partnerships are fundamental to why you get into a particular place. Because if you're going into another country, you need a structure and you need relationships. All reality is about relation. So in that sense, the partners that we have, like the VUB in Brussels, and with also like Paris Toire and of course ULIP, these relationships are fundamental to the ecology of the educational experiences that you can then build up. So it is about the strength of relationship that you get into a country. And we've just established the 3I network, which links the University of Lille with the universities of Ghent and KU Leuven in Belgium, in a new structure post-Brexit, which is to build a trans-Manche, straight English channel, whichever word we want to use, connecting those regions which have an exchange economy connected by the sea, and recognizing there are shared problems. Now, this is a research network, but I do think that's also part of what we need to think about in terms of transnational education in that broad sense, because it's about the values bit is that in order to have good quality research, we know this in the responses to the pandemic, then there has to be collaboration. So transnational education is about those collaborative elements. Now, I think Tim, just to finish off, I think Tim has also highlighted some of the issues around the challenges. And I think that at the bottom of all of that, there has to be a financial return for these experiences, because I think you can still instigate the values of the transnational in your own campus without ever leaving it, in the sense to build into the program international connections, even online connections, in order to establish that exchange is important to learning. But in terms of being able to sustain a campus in another country, it's a tremendous financial investment. It's an investment not just in the space and the partnerships, but in terms of the HR support, the IT support, the understanding the legal support. There's a whole infrastructure of constantly changing aspects. And I think that thinking about transnational education in France and the UK is that one of the challenges clearly is all of that regulation that's now sort of been transformed through Brexit, and how we need to start sort of thinking about how we overcome that. And my hope is that the functional activity will retain itself and will continue, because we have the values and the fundamental understanding of the epistemic belief that this is important, that we find ways around all of the functional challenges. But in order to sustain that, I think there has to be a cultural understanding, and this may come back to diplomacy, to recognize the fundamental heart of T&E as something of the distinctiveness of who we are and how we learn. And when we're understanding that, then governments, universities are already in the place of having to establish that if they're going to have high quality education, because it means those very things are put in place. So I think that post-Brexit, we have to deal with the regulation, we have to deal with the finance, but I think we have now to build the important aspects of what it is to be fundamentally related as part of the values of education. And I think that that's a mission and a campaign that we need to keep moving post-Brexit, because the dangers of assuming that political structures can damage education, can limit education, is one that we as educators and as a part of the higher education sector, we need to challenge that for the future. So that's my particular mapping, and I hope that we can, in the discussion, build this sort of clarity of I'm not saying that my model works, but at least establish some deeper clarity of what we're talking about and why it matters.
Thanks very much, Jeremy. Actually, yes, keep on. From my perspective of actually working in the T&E space in China, there's absolutely a lot of parallels there that I was expecting some, but I'm actually pleasantly surprised to actually see much more than I was expecting. I'm feeling on a bit of an optimistic mood today. I think that we've done enough doom and gloom for the day with the situation and currently in the UK. So I was wondering whether we can actually start with the issues and the challenges, so that hopefully we can move it as swiftly as we can towards the opportunities and the returns in the wider sense. So I was wondering, both of our panelists actually touched on geopolitical issues, and we've had last week the UK-China Joint Institute Alliance annual general meeting, and as you can imagine, there was a lot of discussion on the impact of geopolitical issues for our operations. You've touched on the institutional and on the national level, particularly Tim in his analysis, but some of the concerns that were raised for us in the China space had to do less so at the institutional level and country level, but also talking about what happens with students potentially parents, which are actually a really important variable in China and Southeast Asia, TNE particularly, but that might be different in Europe. So how do you think the geopolitical issues actually might affect transnational education in your sphere, in your space, in terms of recruitment and in terms of connecting with students more broadly? I don't know who would like to start with this. If Tim, you talked about the institutional aspect of geopolitical issues, but I mean, is this something that you're observing or that you see as a potential issue coming up? So more broadly beyond the institutional space. You are muted, Tim.
There we go. If we start with the student perspective, I think our students are tremendously connected with what's going on in the world. We run an international politics program here, a 3-year undergraduate program that works across frontiers, and I completely I love Jeremy's articulation of models, and particularly relate to the epistemic model. Learning across frontiers and because of frontiers and because of barriers, the clashes of ways of thinking are really, really important as catalysts, and we find that in all of our work. Our students are tremendously concerned with the big geopolitical issues. They're also tremendously concerned with big social issues, climate change being one of them, but all of intersectionality, all of the great big questions that are facing how we define and redefine our societies and how we deal on a more humane basis. We work a lot with refugees, with mobility, forced mobility, and so on. So I think all of these issues are absolutely central to the way that the students think about being here. And our students, almost by definition, are international students. They moved to study abroad at the age of 18 or 19. They're spending 3 years in a foreign city, and that again is not only a choice for them, but also an engagement with the world. They have a view that they want to be engaged beyond their own country. Many of our students are British. They want to re-engage with Europe subsequent to Brexit. And so these issues are really, really important ones. But my worry on the negative side is that we're closing down opportunities. The war is closing down relationships with obviously with Russian institutions. We saw what happened to the Central European University in Hungary. We see some of these barriers going up, and I think transnational is perhaps a bit of a solution in a way, in that it's so innovative and so creative in crossing borders and working with institutions that we have to encourage it, and we have to see it as part of the solution. I don't know if that answers your question, Gabriel.
Yes, it's quite broadly, and of course, those issues and the perception of students are also influenced by local issues, as you were describing there, and so that complicates the picture of the already complex operations that we run. So I would like to go to Jeremy. So thinking therefore more broadly, so what do you think are the barriers then faced by students? And actually, Tim talked about the financial and economic model being and the differences between the British system and the majority of European economic models for higher education are. You talked about the Jeremy. You talked about the epistemic and values model, and what we see, particularly in China, is this very strong presence of the transcultural space And I was wondering, when I actually compare the differences, transcultural differences between China and the UK, whether some of the differences in the transcultural space that you may observe in TNE in Europe are probably, I wouldn't say less relevant, but the dimensions are different, and I wonder whether actually what happens in that transcultural space in the transnational education, and is that a barrier for students to, or do they perceive it as a barrier to be attracted by transnational education?
Well, I think these are very interesting sets of questions in terms of where the barriers are. But I'll begin with the barrier where I perceive it at the geopolitical level, because I think that's what Tim is hinting at there. For me, I think the struggle that we have in transnational education is one of a battle between nationalism and the agendas of nationalism against the agendas of globalism. And these two have come in sharp relief in most recent years. And I speak on a day that we've lost our Prime Minister again in the UK, which is an example of the increasing challenges of narrow-minded nationalistic agendas, where we've come through a post-Brexit phase where we're constantly being limited in our scope of what we are as a people. And this, I think, is not the experience of younger generations, that younger generations live in connected worlds through a mediated universe, a connected multi-universe, and that those messages are often ones driven by values and a desire for overcoming the limiting agendas of nationalistic politics. And I think that the difficulty with transnational education is that we are constantly limited by any mark of nationalism in terms of its limiting sphere for our engagements in another country. So there's an ideological battle that we're constantly competing. And I think that universities need to be strong enough to be able to speak from the epistemic and the values-driven part of the agenda in order to overcome that nationalistic focus. Now, I think you're an expert in China, so I think these things may have a different resonance within that context. But in terms of Europe, of course, we've gone through that phase, and I think that the difficulty is that globalization created another problem for us, in the sense that it was globalization for a free market. It wasn't really globalization of integrating the South, the countries of the South, in terms of India and Africa. It wasn't an inclusive globalism, and so I want to kind of harness the values of globalism as inclusion and connectivity, recognizing that difference is a part of that. It's not giving up national identity, but it's saying that national identity requires relationships to the other parts of the world. So there's a huge challenge here to overcome the battles that we're presently experiencing in Europe, to recognize that we need education to speak beyond Brexit. We need to speak beyond the kind of limitations that we've gone through in the last number of years. And I think that I just was speaking to a student that had come from Norway to study with us on our Erasmus. Of course, Erasmus doesn't end until next year, and they were saying what's going to happen after the end of Erasmus. And I think that this is a deeply painful and symbolic moment in terms of education's experience of that limiting nationalism, because we're losing the frameworks by which we can build education. And the only alternative, therefore, is to kind of keep us alert to messaging what value this has for student life, why it enriches experiences. Because we know, for example, that students who have been abroad are more likely to get into employment. Those kinds of qualities are part of the new world that we're entering into. So a very complex sphere of politics, mediated experiences of younger generations and the need of universities to speak to the values of education.
Thanks very much, Jeremy. I'm gonna actually we should actually open up for a quick question and answer while I ask my final question. I'm very mindful of the time. We have really interesting case studies actually coming up, but I want to actually give some space for questions from the audience. I wanted to actually very quickly ask our panelists for maybe examples of the impact of thinking of transnational education from a values or epistemic model. Yesterday with Tim, we were actually reflecting on what I called, for me, transnational education is a perfect laboratory for education. So I'm a scientist, I'm a chemist, and I work in an engineering department. And so I think in terms of laboratories, but I'll give you one example. In China, working in China, the impact of language in learning and understanding, I can't avoid it. Absolutely cannot avoid it. But it's not something I would have actually reflected on as a chemist or as an engineer. And what we actually, and of course, we work really hard at that confluence of the interaction between language and the subject matter in our programs. But what we're coming to reflect, and has actually ended up in the founding of the Centre for Academic Inclusion in Science and Engineering in Queen Mary in London, is the fact that this is operating with students at home too. After all, no one is born a native speaker of STEMglish. And so it's actually our experience in the transnational education sector is completely revolutionizing the way that we're thinking about education more broadly, and is impacting in the way that we actually think about learning and education, even at home. So very quickly, while we wait for also questions from attendees, I mean, what are your experiences of the lessons learned and that you brought back home that you developed in the transnational education space?
Shall I say a quick word? I just to add to what Jeremy said about the value from a student point of view to the value from an institutional point of view. And I think what we've learned over the last couple of decades is that universities that reach out and do things across borders learn and make networks and make relationships. Those that don't learn less and remain more insular. So there's a sort of competencies that are built up. And if we look at the way that Nottingham developed through the development of its campuses and its outreach, really pioneering work, it became a really internationally engaged and focused university. And so, Germany touched on the fact that you need lawyers engaged, you need to engage all the different competencies of the university. Just the fact of having outreach into France means that your legal department has to think across frontiers, across borders, across different systems. It means that your finance team have to think across that. And then to your point, Gabriel, about what we learned and what we bring back, I think one of the very interesting intersections of the way that societies deal with inclusion and diversity in France, in the UK, completely different approaches. And I think there's an enormous amount to be learned from the intersection of those approaches. And I was having this discussion with some American colleagues yesterday as well, that wanted to send some of their social workers over to France for a sort of immersion period to understand what France's approach to integration is and how it contrasts with the American model, because they feel they have that sort of putting together of those different approaches, which is a really productive way for students and human beings to learn. And I think that's, for me, that's something that is really a product of working across borders in that way, to be able to expand the different ways of seeing things and how those might come together and supplement each other. I don't know if Jeremy has
I wonder just a kind of a brief follow-up on that, Tim, because I wonder whether the different systems, and I think you made the point earlier of the fact that you have a public education system in France, although you have the grandes écoles structure as well, but the fact that the global outreach is also built through the national government in France, through the Maison de France structure and the transmission of culture that that France organizes in a particularly unique way, and like the British Council. So I think that maybe there are multiple levels of the framework of which universities can get involved in the exchange programs as well. But there's something about the ecology of higher education in France that makes it quite unique in how transnational education will be developed. Would you say that's right?
He's nodding.
I certainly agree with that. I mean, I think there's. I took part in a working group by France Strategy on the way that France interacts with the world, and it was evident that France see it in a very multidimensional and very government-supported way of building influence. And if you think of the Louvre in Abu Dhabi, there's so many arms of state involved in making that happen, as well as academic institutions. It was really interesting.
The Pasteur Institutes all across the world also ring a bell. I'm Uruguayan, and we hold one of two Pasteur Institutes in South America. Okay, I'm very mindful of time. I'm trying to see if we've got if we have questions from the floor.
I think Jeremy is asking a question. Could you elaborate on what makes the French model unique? And I think that what I understood Tim and I were drawing out, first of all, was a publicly funded education system, as opposed to more, well, in the UK, a kind of hybrid model of part private funded and publicly funded, whereas in the United States you get a kind of private funded model. And so I think the financing of the system is different. But also, I think, Tim, you were indicating that the national agenda of the transmission of French culture creates a different framework, because it's also, in that sense, integrated into a government policy, whereas universities in the UK are with the support of institutions like the British Council, are kind of largely working as individual operators and institutions. I don't know whether you want to add anything to that one.
I think you put it well. Maybe we should hand over to our colleagues with the questions.
We have now a series of actually very interesting case studies. So on European alliances, including UK partners, game changers, and test beds for a renewed approach to transnational education. So our first case study is from Mihab Pham, Counselor for Science and Technology, French Embassy in the UK.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be with you today, and maybe I will give a complementary point of view compared to what has been said. And I think that both Tim and Jeremy gave a very broad vision and definition of the transnational education. And I would like, and I heard from Jeremy that he considers that there are diplomatic issues in the transnational education, and I can confirm that as a representative of a foreign affairs ministry, we are very much concerned. And I wanted, in the first part of my presentation, and maybe I will go to an example of European alliances of universities in the second part of my presentation, maybe after my colleagues will introduce their own model. But in the first part of my presentation, I would like to tell you that transnational education is also a strong concern of the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, since we have major priorities in terms of geopolitics, and especially with Europe, although now with Brexit we are on the border of Europe in the UK. There is also a concern about the link with African countries, not only the Francophone ones, and also with other countries in Africa, and the Indo-Pacific region. So one of the tools to improve and strengthen our French position in these areas is to settle joint university campuses. The model is probably the Franco-German university, which has been quite successful in the past. And in these areas, well, somebody mentioned the Louvre in Abu Dhabi, or other examples that already exist, like also Institut Pasteur having campuses everywhere in many countries in the world. But concerning the regions that I have mentioned, we have ideas of developing new campuses. There is already one in Senegal, the Franco-Senegalese University, and we have project for a Franco-Indian campus, and also a Franco-Australian university is under consideration. Now, if we look at what happens in the United Kingdom, there are already several examples of such French academic and research, because as has been said also, research is also a platform to facilitate, research collaboration will facilitate also student mobility. So we have several examples of successful stories in the UK. And for instance, I would like to mention the campus of ESCP Europe, École Supérieure de Commerce de Paris, which has opened 6 campuses abroad in Berlin, London, Madrid, Paris, Turin, and Warsaw. And in London, this campus has been established nearly 30 years ago, and it's one of the only French institution to be registered at the Office for Students, which allow the international student to obtain a visa for British studies. And they are currently applying to obtain a degree awarding powers in order to deliver British diplomas, which would be a big change. I can also mention Dauphine, PSL in London, which has been in the UK since 2014. And it was initially a very small group of 25 undergraduate students, a pioneer cohort, if I can say. Then in 2015, they established a partnership with UCL, which enabled the bilingual students to study a third foreign language at UCL. And in 2018, they launched their first summer program and relocated in a new quarter in Angel. And now they have 30 students per year. And they still consider themselves as a boutique institution where students can benefit from an individualized attention, like in France, in this kind of grandes écoles or very selective type of institution. Now we also have some example of research institutions which have successfully settled in the UK. For example, the Maison Française d'Oxford, which was founded at the end of the Second World War through the joint initiative of University of Paris at the time and University of Oxford. And now it's under the supervision of CNRS and of our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, associated with the University of Oxford. And it's a hub for Franco-British academic interdisciplinary collaboration. And last but not least, I would like to mention a more recent initiative, which has been taken by INRIA, the French Computer Research Institution, together with University College London, UCL. They joined forces in 2019 for a partnership centered on machine learning and artificial intelligence. And now there is a potential for crossover into other disciplines and for more partners to get involved. So to conclude this first part, as the Department of Higher Education, Research and Innovation of the French Embassy, we are very keen to support these kind of initiatives, among others, and they perfectly illustrate what we really want to support, which is the success of Franco-British collaboration. And you mentioned several times that post-Brexit, especially of importance to have this kind of models. So it depends on you, Gabrielle, whether or not you would like me to go on, or maybe give the floor to my colleagues who will maybe give specific example of their European university alliances, and then I can come back to what we, again, as an embassy, we can do to support these alliances where there are both French and British partners involved.
Yes, I think that's a good idea, especially because it will continue the dialogue. And in the meantime, if anyone wants to ask a question, please write them in the Q&A box, and I will bring them to the panelists towards the end. So our next case study is from Aurélien Crébic, Civica Executive Director, Sciences Po Paris.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. And I would like, before presenting the Civic Alliance, thank the British Council for creating those seminars. I mean, those are excellent platform to broaden your horizons. I was paying a very close attention to the remarks presented by Tim and Jeremy, and it was very interesting and important. So I will be presenting the Civica Alliance. Before diving in and showcasing and explaining how and why the Civica Alliance is one of the best alliances in place in Europe, let me just maybe share a few words about the European University Alliance initiative itself. And why am I referring and taking the time to present the initiative is because the key word, since it's a program launched by the Commission and heavily supported by Erasmus+, the keyword is transnational cooperation. So it covers education and research. And in the eye of the Commission and more largely the European Council, the idea is to deploy a new scheme along Erasmus+ and Horizon Europe. Erasmus+ would support education, Horizon Europe research, and the European University Initiative, transnational cooperation. The ambition behind is to build a series of, let's say, 30 to 40 alliances, thematic ones, that would build and develop integrated activities at all levels of education, including also research. In the case of the Civica Alliance, we have been selected as among the very first ones as a pilot during the pilot phase. In 2019, it gathers very well-established universities and business schools in the social sciences across Europe, among which a UK funding partner. And the Civica Alliance has been deploying itself during the first pilot phase, which has just ended in 2022. And in July, we had the pleasure to hear that after a very, very busy fall and a very, very busy winter, our new proposal has been successfully reviewed by the Commission, and the Civica Alliance will be supported for a new cycle of 4 years through an enlarged framework, since we are going to expand and bring 2 new partners at the table, i.e. University from Spain and the Warsaw School of Economics from Poland. If you want to have a better understanding of the alliance, I invite you to visit a website at civica.eu. It's very well done and it fully describes what we are trying to do. So behind that, let's say it has been a very important initiative across Europe, gathering a lot of attention and also involving many universities across Europe to build those alliances around the notion of transnational cooperation. So I don't know how it relates or echoes what has been discussed about how we define transnational education. Whether it's a new definition, it has a new dimension, but it has been the priority, at least at the European level, for the last 3 years. And there is also a nuance here, because we are not discussing here about offshore campus, because the second key notion is inter-university campus. So we try to avoid being located in one place, but instead we are building a network. We are connecting existing campuses. We are connecting existing location and building a new set of activities through or under the Civica umbrella. For example, we've been developing activities at bachelor level, master level, and PhD level. I'll explain that a bit later, but also activities outside the classrooms. We had the pleasure to organize sport tournaments and also cultural tournaments to build a European identity, because one of the key objectives, let's say, of the initiative is to innovate in the field of education and research, but also to promote the European ethos or the European values largely defined. Jeremy, in his comments, were referring to the notion of values, and it is true that this is an absolute, it's a very important keyword, at least for the Alliance, for the initiative themselves, because all the members are regrouping around a joint vision and joint values, because given the level of integration expected, let's say the endorsement around the vision and the value is very important. Otherwise, the Alliance will never be fully operational. Through the COVID crisis, I'm sure you watched that the higher education landscape, which has been hesitating for years whether or not it would be important to develop digital activities, in 48 hours it was done. The higher education sector made a full room for digital activities, and it created a window of opportunities for the Alliance, because through the notion of inter-university campus, alliances have been building a digital campus and digital activities because, or thanks, it depends from where you stand, of the COVID-19 crisis. So based on those elements of context, Civica Alliance has been deploying a series of activities. One of the important goals is, one example is to build a European doctoral school in the social sciences, connecting the 8 or 10 doctoral schools across the Alliance. And one of the key activities we have been deploying is what we call the European early stage researcher course catalog, where PhD seminars are accessible to all PhD students depending on their field of interest. So if you go on the website, you can access the ERSAR course catalog. And for example, I am a student from Sciences Po. I'm from Bocconi, writing a thesis on microeconomics, and I need to access a seminar from the European University Institute. I can register and follow and have access to this seminar online, but it has been a very successful activity with a very high level of interest. I understood that through the presentation, it was also important to explain why those alliances could be of interest for UK partner. And in your case, what we understood is first, again, what was important is the value and the vision. There were a lot of pre-existing ties. So beyond the national context, there was a strategic interest for the UK partner to continue strengthening its ties with the natural partners in Europe, with the continental partners. And through the alliance, it was also a way to continue affirming its European attention, European ties with close continental partners. And so in terms of content, it was a platform to support mobility in its simplest term, but also to innovate in education and research, because through those alliances, we have been deploying activities in education and research, and there was an appetite, an interest for those activities in terms of added value, and also how they would, in terms of international European cooperation. For the second phase, the decision has been made to continue considering this UK partner as a funding and full partner at the consortium level. We know what's the UK position toward the Erasmus Plus scheme and also what is at stake regarding the Horizon Europe scheme. I don't want to comment on those very delicate matters, but at the consortium level, it was very important to keep the UK partner at the table and to continue working and developing the activities, since the level of funding to which the UK partner can have access is limited. We are making a choix à la carte for the activities to make sure that they can still operate and have access to the activities that are of most interest for them. And at the end of the day, there are still a lot of working groups which create a community of practice. So there is a professional network because since the scope of the initiative is quite wide, it involves quite a large series of colleagues. So it's another way to bring expertise and to share experience at the European table.
Thanks very much, Aurélien. And last but not least, we have Luciana Hadut-Kagi, Vice President in charge of Utopia More at Kirgi Paris University.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Gabriel, and thank you to the organizers. It's a very interesting webinar, and I'm very happy to participate here with these distinguished colleagues. Where to start? Civica may be the best alliance among the specialized one. Utopia is a comprehensive one, so I will explain you why Utopia is the best alliance among the comprehensive ones. But I think it's very important also to speak about this idea of a game changer. Our alliance is a game changer after maybe some initiatives that were launched but not followed because of the Brexit, because of the pandemic also. And I think I would like to propose to you an analysis of how things are and how they could have been if the past wouldn't have been changed. Jeremy and Tim also, but mostly Jeremy, spoke about this idea of crossing borders, doing education in another country. I believe at the level of the alliances, we don't speak about countries and borders. We speak about cross-campus activities. Aurélien spoke about cross-university campus. This is the aim of the alliances. In Utopia, we speak about cross-campus activities, and that is interesting. Maybe that's a first game changer, the way in which we look at the map of Europe and how UK universities, French universities, and the others participate into the building of a common, what we call in Utopia, but elsewhere also, Europe of knowledge, Europe of science. We build Europe through these cross-campus activities. And it's not about cross-border, and it's about how we participate into this European belonging for our students and for our staff, how we participate into this development or the definition of a European identity for all of us. And maybe now the perspective could change. It's not about crossing borders in Europe, but regarding Europe and the rest of the world, Europe at the global scale. Now it's about engaging a dialogue between Europe and us, European universities, and the rest of the world. And this dialogue, I believe, is more needed than ever today. And Utopia aims into this purpose of participation at a global dialogue. For that, you see here, no, here, We have this idea of connected communities in Utopia, and you spoke about communities also earlier, Tim or Jeremy. It's about how we engage our students and staff into these connected communities. And during the 3 first years, Utopia follows the same chronology as Civica, so I will not come back on that. During these 3 first years, we building blocks or embryos of what Utopia will be in 10 years' time. And we build connected learning communities. We have today 30 of those involving students and teachers, transnational modules, transnational model of education. And the aim is to internationalize students by all means, and not only, of course, by the classical mobility. But we also build connected research communities, researchers in the same area in several universities of the Alliance. We are 10 universities today in Utopia. And of course, we may have communities of 3 or 4 or 6, or whatever. We also have this program of co-tutel. We have today 55 co-tutel Ph.Ds in Utopia. We didn't have those 3 years ago, and we think it's just incredible how our enseignants-chercheurs, researchers, and students see Utopia as an opportunity for them to build a research project, which is an educational project, across those campuses, and they do it very well. And we have postdoctoral, etc. So all these embryos participate in what we call now global connected communities. You see, we added global to this connected communities concept because we enter the second phase, which is called MORE. Utopia is the Alliance, Utopia MORE is the second project, Gabrielle. So global connected communities, because we have 2 main objectives that we would like to achieve in 10 years' time, and that is to build a Utopia College, and that is for everything that we do in the education area, and a Utopia Global Institute, tackling global challenges in different ways. Tackling those challenges also with our global partners. We have today 4 global partners in Morocco, South Africa, South Korea, and Australia. And maybe that's where the transborder or transcontinental enters. It is interesting to see how we can involve these partners in our future activities. And now, okay, it's good to speak about the global scale. So how can us as alliances play a role on that global scale? And it's an issue of impact. How are we now able to translate everything that we do? Because we are tired, we did so many things and we are very happy about it. How can we translate that into an impact, an actual impact of what we do at a global scale? And in Utopia, we want to address this issue by what is called the science diplomacy. You spoke about diplomacy several today here. Science diplomacy is very important, and a specific understanding of it, and that is how European universities, but the academia in general, plays a role, an actual role, not just an advisor, but plays a role in this global dialogue, the dialogue at a global scale, how our scientists are able to propose ideas and engage now in maybe dialogues in fields that politically are dangerous, let's say. So this is our idea to work on science diplomacy. Now, does this European alliance replaces the relation that CY and Warwick, the University of Warwick, had? Because, of course, we had a relation before Utopia. Warwick and CY were involved in the Build Beyond Borders action, French action. So we aimed at some common objectives at a bilateral level. And in some way, the European alliance replaced some of those objectives. But what we value very much in Utopia are bilateral relations also. So French colleagues know in September we were supposed to submit, not supposed, we could submit this kind of project, diversification des ressources, finding new ways to for the development of the university. And there CY and Warwick worked together. It's not a whole utopian project, it's a bilateral one. So now we are trying to develop something that could be an institute. We'll see on design, the CY École de Design, School of Design, and the design initiatives in Warwick. So it will be about several levels of education, from bachelor to executive education. We cross fingers because we do that a lot when we submit projects, and we'll see. And last but not least is about the legal thing, because you mentioned it also. It's very important now to understand how we continue to collaborate. And of course, Warwick is a part of Utopia. It will always be a part of Utopia. We were on Tuesday in Barcelona for the kickoff of Utopia More project. Warwick was there as usual. But we are also now trying to build an association, ASBL, a Belgium International Nonprofit Association. And that's another idea of having 10 founding members in that legal status. And it would be interesting, for example, to hear how you deal with this legal situation beyond our, of course, friendship between French and British universities.
Thank you, Luciana, very much for that case study. And I'm going to go back to Miha and the thoughts and reflections from the embassy and the diplomatic space.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I will be very quick to let you know that, of course, as it has been said by Luciana and Aurélien, we're especially concerned by the future of the partnership between the French and the British members among these European alliances. So we made an inquiry, and we realized that 6 of the alliances of European universities brought together French and British partners, among which Utopia and Civica, as it has been said, but also Circle U, UNUL, Europa, sorry for the pronunciation, and also Civis, where there is an associated partnership. So in last May, we gathered the French and the British partners of these 6 alliances to discuss with them about what are their problems, do they wish to go on working together, especially for the British members, what is the advantage, what are the inconvenience, and will they plan to pursue and to go on working together. And after one day of discussion, it appears very clearly that on both sides, the French and the British side, the member, and probably, of course, all the other members of these alliances, as it has been said by Luciana and Aurélien, are very keen to go on working together, even though the European fundings are not coming directly to the British teams. Now they also raised a few questions, a few problems. Some have been mentioned by Luciana and Aurélien. What we have in mind is to have a kind of roadmap based on what has been said during this day, just to remind our authorities, our stakeholders, about what has been said and how important it is to allow these groups to go on working together and even to broaden their association. So maybe just a few points that, well, taking home message, if I can say, all of them express the need to have the support of the French and British authorities, as well as the EU delegation in the UK, but also the EU Commission. They really emphasize the fact that these alliances are based on a bottom-up approach, and they are very diverse, and this is a strength. I mean, they should not be all on the same format. It is very nice that they have their own either topics or way of working together. What they particularly value is the shared practices, which enable each member to reflect on its own internal development, but also they can benefit from partners' comparative advantages. They face the problem of interoperability of the systems, and they know that this is a very accurate problem that has to be addressed, both administrative and academic levels. They realize that they still have a lack of visibility, and the communication issues, the way to measure the impact of what they have been doing together is a very important point, and they are thinking of having a platform to communicate their results, or catalogs, or staff exchanges. So they have a lot of ideas to share. They also wish to have more members of the general academic community and students to get to know about these alliances and to join and benefit from the opportunities which are available. As it has been said, Luciana mentioned how to raise new resources, fundings through contacts with companies, or organizing summer schools, also apply together to international funding schemes. And also they mentioned the fact that these alliances are still fragile, and they need to be maintained, even though at national level, the governance of the universities are changing. So there is a lot at stake at the moment. And again, in this post-Brexit context, we are really very keen to encourage these alliances and the British partners to stay inside these alliances, and the French also to build closer bilateral links, either by creating or signing agreements, and bilateral agreement to facilitate the exchange of students and researchers. And whatever we can do at our level, we will do it to facilitate these alliances to go on.
Sorry, I was pressing the wrong button. Thanks very much, and very mindful of time. So I've got actually tons of questions, but I would like to open the questions to the audience. I think we have time for a couple of questions, but in preparation, I would like to ask all of our panelists today if you could summarize in one phrase your take-home message that you got from today's activity. That'll be a great way to actually highlight learning, which I think is important, and when we come together to discuss these things. So are there any questions from the audience? There's a question about China. I don't want to go into a separate discussion about that. It's a question that says students have to take Gaokao, equivalence of high school diploma. Competition is very fierce. Yes, I know about that. Is becoming a trend now? Actually, to put it into context, there are 200,000 students in China, in UK transnational education only, and 257 bachelors offered in UK China transnational education only. So it's been going on for a long time, and it's been very strong for quite some time now. Any other questions from the floor? Can we go around then and actually maybe say what our take-home message from today? For me, if I get us started, I've really liked the reflection on the diversity of the different models and how that actually enriches the space. And particularly, the first question, if you look at the blurb of today, is about measuring impact and how this was reframed in the discussion today, and thinking about the values and the epistemic model. So reframing effectively, what do we think by impact, and how do we measure that impact? And I think that that's really important. But in these very rich space of transnational education. Who would like to go next? Shall I do it as a who I have here next? Luciana? I don't want to put anyone on the spot.
Okay. Well, I will take on that epistemic model that Jeremy presented, and the other, let's consider the other at a global scale and how we can engage in educative programs and models with Africa, Asia, South America, North America. I think that's important now to get out of these Brexit discussions and how we decide to do things at a bilateral level. It's more than that today. The stake, I think, is so more important. That's how we find our business model together.
Thanks very much. Aurélien?
Yes, thank you. Maybe two remarks. First is we are here discussing in France, but those alliances have a European angle. And as executive director, my responsibility is to always keep an eye and to try to represent this European diversity and not to discuss the French national context. This is very important. That's why that's one of my important responsibility, just to protect the European diversity and identity of those alliances as such. And then during the pilot phase, because of COVID, we have been focusing a lot on building the alliance and make it work at the European level. And the next chapter, the one we are opening, is going to be truly international. And that's why I was very happy to hear the comments made by Tim that always keep an eye on broader horizons. So it fed my thinking, and I'm very grateful. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Yes.
Well, I think it's good that as the French representative, of course, I will value more the French point of view, but it's not incompatible because we think very strongly that bilateral connection between France and the UK at the moment can also open to more international connections, go together to third countries or to Africa or to South America, to Asia. It's really something that we would like to do because both countries have their own partnership. And of course, we can take advantage of the partnership of each country and go together as northern country to other countries in the world. So this is not a problem of being bilateral. I fully agree that the international opening is absolutely valuable. What I would like to say in a more maybe personal point of view is that the connection between research and mobility should not be, well, it is very important. I mean, and this is the way the alliances are evolving at the moment, widening, but also going from mobility, student mobility to more research cooperation, because my personal experience is that when you have strong research collaboration, then it generates a lot of mobility of students around the research project. So I think that the evolution of these alliances is in the good sense. Now we also have to face that these alliances raise new problems. What kind of diploma? What kind of interoperability, etc. And we also have to try to solve these problems, which are not obvious.
Thanks very much. Jeremy?
I think the one thing I want to reflect on a little bit more came through this discussion around that we just had around the inter-university model. And I think Luciana's point about the cross-campus model, I think that there is a kind of interstate politic which supports that. And we might want to kind of, I like the utopia of going beyond nation states, but the nation state actors still determine those educational structures and the alliances behind it. But nonetheless, I'm kind of intrigued by reflecting a little bit more, and we'll take away how the values element can overcome the borders around that cross-campus understanding.
Thank you. Tim?
I'd like to start off, and I was also very inspired by Luciana's framework of intercampus collaboration. I like the getting away from borders. But I think engaging in transnational education is highly beneficial for students, highly beneficial for institutions as a learning experience. And what I'd like to focus on, just finish, is efficiency, because I think all of us struggle on many, many levels to build new pathways. And it's not efficient for institutions, it's not efficient for individuals to be trying to do everything by yourself. So I really welcome the alliances, the multilateral frameworks that are developing, because I think that really helps individual universities avoid finding cabinets full of agreements and each of them having to chart their own legal framework, each of them having to learn by themselves. And I think the sharing from this sort of pioneering work on at a multinational level is really, really important. So I'd just like to end with that.
Thank you very much. And now we're coming back to the beginning. So last but not least, we go back to Anne to close the day.
Well, first of all, I want to thank all of you for the most rich discussion with examples and to really challenge us to be thinking about this. I felt as though there was this constant kaleidoscope that was evolving as you looked at different parts of this and how it's evolving. And I think that speaks well to not just the values, but the value, and depending on whether it's to individuals or to, you know, our societies as a whole, and how the HE sector is really embracing this and moving it forward. I love the examples, and I think that the British Council is very much involved in this space, both as a thought partner with all of you. We have our initiatives around the transnational education, and we've got a cohorts that we're working with that are learning cohorts to try to see what are these practices and how can these evolve. Among the things I think that were very important today that we're pleased are also introduced in everything that you described was how these new T&E models or the T&E alliances or the work that's being carried forward is also contributing to addressing the big, large questions of the day, whether the SDGs or we've got sustainability issues, you know, what you're doing today, the examples you gave, these are structuring society and structuring our abilities to respond to that and creating sort of the enabling environment, if you will, for us to really move those things forward. And I think that was quite exciting, and you heard that, you know, as each of you spoke. British Council was delighted to be a partner in creating this today and this opportunity. I think this is just a photo as part of the long film, and we're very excited that this is something that we're collaborating in together. Watch this space, look at all the great resources that are here, keep in touch, because I know that this is one of the ways that we help build our community. And so all of you that have been here today, thank you for joining us. And with that, we'll just say thank you to all our participants one more time, bravo, and let's continue on this wonderful journey together. Thank you.